All right, we're all set.
Okay. Hello, I'm Rebecca Ripple, artist in residence and head of the sculpture department at Cranbrook Academy of Art. I'd like to welcome everyone to our Visiting Artist Lecture Series. Joining us tonight from New York is artist, performer, activist, and educator Jonathan Gonzalez. I first heard about Jonathan from a friend of mine at Rutgers. As I became more familiar with Jonathan's work, I felt it was important to have them visit. Their use of their body to focus on implicit politics is poignant and has an open-ended complexity, making me very eager to hear them talk tonight. I hand it over to sculpture fellow Luke Warren, who graduated last year, to introduce Jonathan. Thanks.
We are so excited to have Jonathan with us tonight to discuss their arts practice. A number of students in the sculpture department have been dealing with performance in their work this year, and we are thrilled to have an active performer working at the intersections of multiple medias here with us. Gonzalez's recent projects / collaborations have been shown at Performance Space New York, Dance Space Project, Region (ES Mag, Homeschool PDX, Yale Union Times Paragon Arts Gallery, working on water in collaboration with Mario Gooden at the Columbia School of Architecture, CCIO, Contact Quarterly, MoMA PS1 times Abrams Art Center, Black MoMA Museum of Modern Art. Their curations include Sunday service at Knockdown Center and Movement Research Fall Festival, Invisible Material. Previously an LMCC Workspace resident, NARS Foundation Artist in Resident, Jerome Foundation Fellow, Mertz Gilmore Grantee, Art Matters Fellow, and Performance Arts / Theater Foundation for Contemporary Arts Grantee. Please help me in welcoming Jonathan Gonzalez.
That's so sweet. Hello, everybody. I'm going to, because time is always leaving very fast, I'm going to start, but I have assembled moments where I hope that you will use the chat or speak or feel inclined, okay? Is that okay with everyone? And please do write or cut me off while I'm speaking if you can't hear me or if you have a question or etc. Okay? Yes, I love all the nods. It's so nice to see. Okay, let me share my screen just to start with. Super simple. Okay, yay. I can see myself on the side. So I'm going to kind of use today. I look forward to doing studio visits. I want to just say thank you to Cranbrook again for the invitation. It's really lovely. Wish I could be there in person, but it's nice to be here in some form together. And I will spend this hour giving a kind of organization to myself, my practice, what I'm up to right now, because I think like you all, for the PDFs that I've seen, are dealing with the kind of moment that I feel like we all are in, deep questions about how to move forward and what to take with us. So I hope that this gives you just an invite into what I'm working towards. Here's a structure, and let me know if you have any questions. I'd like to start off with like a little round of introductions, very brief. I'll put a timer on so we're really clear. And then I'm going to share a draft of a film I'm currently working on through a commission by Brick Arts, which is here in Brooklyn. I'm a video art resident there. And then I'm going to take these kind of three very major, like 40-week conversation topics and try to condense them into 10 minutes together. And hopefully when we do studio visits, you can and I can talk around it if we have more questions together. But three of the things that I think I'm trying to pull out and center right now for myself in multiple ways are conditions of brutality and how creativity can meet that conversation, conditions of nature and poetry. And then we'll wrap. Okay. So I'm going to start and I'm going to say after I go, Luke will go next. And then each person decide who follows you when you finish. I'm going to put a timer on of about 10 minutes. And it might be a little less since we're at 6:05. But the question's super improvisational, performatively. So I would like to ground into meeting each other. So you can choose naming, and some of you have already done this in your PDFs, but naming the kinds of authors, the themes, perhaps the entities, the beyonds, the worlds, the context to which you either organize your practice, your teaching, your pedagogy, or the way you come into the world, which I'm saying the word analysis from a political education lens, but that can mean anything to you. So I'll start it off. I think today for me, I'm trying to organize the ways that I'm approaching my practice, and I'm looking at my dry erase board right now in my apartment in Flatbush on Lenape land, and looking at this dry erase board, and I've been dealing a lot with being in proximity to people and talking to people about Sylvia Wynter. And I think Sylvia Wynter has a lot to show us and to teach us, and is organizing my thought about what the role of culture is in building out a new narrative where we do affirm life and affirm each other's life and affirm a planetary life and a non-human life. And that's it. That's all I'm going to say for now. And I'll pass it on to Luke.
So I've been dealing most recently in my practice with this feeling of an internal sort of body betrayal that's dealing with specifically this autoimmune that I have, which caused all my hair to fall out. So I'm kind of been dealing with that, and I've been dealing with that, and then sort of pairing it and intersecting it with this time in which we're in with COVID, and this sort of feeling of another sense of body betrayal in terms of primarily the breath. And so for me, I've been reading and dealing with ideology surrounding Buddhism. And one line that I keep coming back to is this notion of your most loyal friend is your breath, and how I've been questioning that right now, in the sense that I don't feel like it's my most loyal friend. And I'm sort of struggling with the fact that there could be potentially something dangerous in my breath, that there's also something potentially, or that there is something in my body that's killing this sort of extension of hair outwards. And so my most recent work's been kind of dealing with that and this sort of level of disappointment, and kind of just feeling that out, I guess, and being gentle to myself. So that's where I've been at with that. I'll pass it to Rob, is on my screen next, so I'll pass it to Rob.
I knew you were going to pick me. I'm so nervous. Yeah, I guess kind of the things that I've been dealing with was kind of creating these psychedelic, sorry, so nervous. Yeah, no, I'm trying to create these, these like therapeutic psychedelic enclosed environments where people can kind of deal with their traumas and memories. And this is kind of relating from a traumatic event that happened with one of my close friends who committed suicide, and from years and years of going through therapy and kind of trying to cope with those realities. And through doing that, I went through therapy and yoga retreats and like these festivals to kind of deal with those things. So I'm kind of bringing people into these sound bath environments where they can kind of feel relieved and kind of escape from everyday life. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Carmichael, next.
Hi, everyone, and Jonathan, hello. I've been writing about my work a lot today, so at the moment I'm invested in explaining myself. So this is a fun pop quiz on that for me. And today I'm thinking a lot about the politics of what it means to take up space. And who gets to do that and what it means to be an artist doing that. And I will pass it to Kelly A.
Hi, everyone. Right now, I'm interested in exploring identity, repressed memories, and trauma. A lot of my work, I deal with connecting with the external world, and I'm looking internal now and trying to connect with that to maybe make sense of the things that are going on around me. So yeah. Let's see. Noelle.
Hi. Oh, sorry. I don't know. I'm not really sure what I'm doing. I think I've been thinking about like I guess memory and like intangible stability and like grasping for a future place. I like talking to my friends and making work about that and like that collaborative effort and what manifests in that trust in other people and that shared experience. And I don't know, I've been thinking a lot about my dead mom and how she's haunting me, but like in a good way. So that's been something really fun. Let's see, I guess, Joe, do you want to go?
Hi. Yeah, I think right now I've been thinking about time a lot. And this like slow transformation of time and like how things can go like unnoticed. And so like thinking about scales of time, I think, and like to give examples like aging, I've been thinking about a lot, and how like it just like things change and then you don't notice that they're happening, and then all of a sudden you have these like moments where you realize that there's like something that has like really just like completely changed about like an identity that you relate to. So yeah, I think there like that kind of has been on my mind in different areas, like thinking about it in terms of like just different things that that transform over time, but not realizing until you actually realize those things and until they're just gone. And let's see, I'll pass this to Malik.
Hey, so yeah, I've been thinking about ways that people disengage with certain medias and practices by which images exclude people, not just through like the frame, but like how they set up a narrative and create an identity for certain things. My work mainly has to do with mental illness and how aspects of mental illness and the perception of mental illness places people in a different reality at times, and how to process that. I've been thinking about Torquemada de Son's Black Compositional Thought since I've seen her work a couple of years ago. I've been thinking about Fred Moten's ideas on Afro-pessimism and other ideas within Afro-pessimism, and thinking about the condition of Blackness within America as a thought about exclusion, and how to incorporate that with ideas that I have in terms of perception and cultural relevance, and what it means to be excluded from cultural relevance. Kelly Cronin.
Yeah, I'm actually gonna stop us there just for time,
Okay.
because that felt like a sermon that you just gave us, Malik. So thank you. I'm gonna let that be the last thing that gets said. And also, I'm a huge fan of Turquoise Dyson. We shared a show together at MoMA. The evening that I did Black MoMA, Turquoise was doing her work with another collaborator of mine, Mario Gooden, who I would definitely recommend if you're into her work. He's works on Black architecture. But I'm going to keep going. and let me know if something's not visible. There we go. Okay, I'm going to show a bit of the film itself, and maybe I'll just say the credits ahead of time. The first voiceover that you'll hear is Ashil Mbembe, and it's his most recent work, Notes on Brutalism. And Ashil Mbembe, if you do not know who he is, I definitely recommend looking him up. Currently teaching at the Institute in Johannesburg, and has been writing about thinking, just riffing off of what Luke was saying, the politics of breathing in a landscape where the air is so polluted. For instance, he's speaking about pollution, but also speaking about the will and the politics of breath. Then second is sound by collaborator Rudy Gersten. And then the last is a performance, an actor and a voiceover, who is this image, Chaz Giovanni Bruce, who's another collaborator of mine. So I'll stop sharing this screen so that I can share the screen I'm trying to share, which is this screen. And what I'll do first is just a little trial run to make sure you're getting the sound. This should do it, but you're just gonna give me like a thumbs up, hopefully, if you get it. Okay, cool. It's about 10 minutes and I'll cut it at a certain point.
And I have defined brutalism as a contemporary process whereby power is constituted, it is expressed, it is reconfigured, it acts, and it reproduces itself as a geomorphic force. Through processes that include fracturing and fissuring, emptying vessels, drilling, expelling organic matter. In a word, by what I term depletion. Indeed, if we are to believe the most recent studies of the trajectories of the Earth system, we may well be fast approaching a threshold beyond which the Earth might be irreversibly turned into a hothouse. Now, in the strict sense of the term, a hothouse is not only unfit for human habitation. I keep coming to that question of habitation, habitability, and its opposite, and inhabitability. So hothouse, a sense of a house unfit for habitation, human and non-human, or one in which many cannot dwell. They cannot dwell, or for that matter, breathe. I can't breathe. It is also a house incapable of sustaining any form of life.
fluctuations, settled of the world. Breathe. Bridges being conceived underground and undersea, as real as you are breathing right now. Breathe. It is not yours to hold or to name as real. This possibility. Breathe. Every fiber before you yelling freedom, drenched in the womb of your mother. You now are a result named possibility. Where is ceremony? Breathe. Who did and did not survive for this divine homecoming that awaits you? Tell until your voice trembles truths. Breathe. What jails remain of your time, of your body? Speak the violences that cannot hide when we are inside of each other. Always inside of each other, aren't we? Shall we walk lightly with all of the earth as inevitable then? Ooh, breathe. What an unspeakable thing to believe aloud. The chance of life. Choose. Outside. Still. Breathe. Breathe.
Okay, that's a very, very early draft, but happy to share it. Thank you. Thank you. Small applause. I like it. Let me share back what I was doing over here, and I'll keep it going. Okay, so I just want to get into 3 themes, and the time now is 6:28, so I will kind of go through these themes, which are different examples that are coming up for me in terms of reference, like what is the body of analysis that's building out this film in process right now. And I put some questions in there. You can feel free to be like, none of this is relevant to me because I'm not there in my context, or I don't have the capacity, and we can talk about it later. I'll try to leave some time at the end if we have it, but I might also just give you a lot of this unfinished language to work with, and we can talk about it in studio spaces, or you could contact me separately. So starting with brutality as a theme, I just want to ground the readership. So thinking about Horton Spillers, I want to read this quote aloud just to honor it. This profitable atomizing of the captive body provides another angle on the divided flesh. We lose any hint or suggestion of a dimension of ethics, of relatedness between human personality and its anatomical features, between one human personality and another, between human personality and cultural institutions. To that extent, the procedures adopted for the captive flesh demarcate a total objectification, as the entire captive community becomes a living laboratory. And this is Horton Spillers speaking from her work, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, which I would definitely recommend, an American grammar book. And I want to talk about a few things, this idea of grammar. How do we talk about, going back to maybe what Malik was saying, a kind of organization of value and hierarchy and a taxonomy of practice, which is a human syndrome, but we can specify as an American project. And a lot of my work is trying to deal with where I'm placed. So I'm currently in the United States, and it's where I'm born and raised, although my context descends from other places too. And I'm a traveling person, not now, but typically. But a lot of my work is trying to deal with the conditions of life here. And my answers to what are the grammars to the American project, what are the grammars to a post-colonial global narrative, things coming up with looking at this quote, are situated in three things. So planetary thinking, and we can talk about that, and I'll talk more about that through this presentation. And I want to just lift up names because that's my practice. And I think it organizes a way of us not being extractive in terms of how we think of our singularity. But Paul Gilroy's work, which is trying to really link the conditions of life and sustainability to the planet as it pertains to Blackness as the key to freedom. And y'all might already know Saidiya Hartman. If you don't, definitely get into it. But Saidiya Hartman's work in the archive has been prolific because it permits a kind of level of speculation, which is necessary when dealing with Black history, which is something that typically the archive lacks. But the archive itself is a weapon, and all of you have touched it in different ways in terms of being artists. So thinking about that. Black and Indigenous cosmologies, which I think are located in later parts of the film, but what I'm thinking through as someone who's also a farmer and in the process of always thinking with stewarding land is how my art practice is in relationship to those modes of being in time, being in space, being in other forms of ecology, and modes of practice that are not completely leaning into the consumptive initiative of capitalism. Of course, we can't be outside of it right now, but we can dream bigger. And so I'm going to keep myself to time. Yeah. So one example, I want to talk about Denise Ferreira da Silva. I think I want to get into talking about grammar in terms of talking about algorithms, which is leaning into another work I'm drafting right now. And please just get in the chats, but I'll probably throw some stuff at you that you do know or don't know, and I'm willing to take questions. So starting with this quote on the far left, in the modern Western imagination, Blackness has no value, it is nothing. And that's a reference to thinking about Afro-pessimism for those who are interested in that, but it's also thinking about algorithmic theories. So as such, it marks an opposition that signals a negation, which does not refer to contradiction. For Blackness refers to matter as the thing. It refers to that without form. It functions as a nullification of the whole signifying order that sustains value in both its economic and ethical scenes. Which is to say that the structure of the world post-enlightenment is one that operates in positive life, or one, and negative life, that which exists outside of even the imagination of that place, that life that gets policed or is considered criminal or is carceralized, is negative life, negative one, which can be associated with Blackness. And that's not pigmentation, this is a Black political alignment. So you can be a Black skin, but be embedded in notions of supremacy, right? So it's not just all the same, it's not flat. The second point, the relationship between life and Blackness, -1, using basic mathematical procedures, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. And I only offer 3 of those here, but in all the instances you can see in using her process of being an interdisciplinary scholar, that you'd never arrive at a positive signification when Blackness touches life or Blackness touches the civil order that we deal with. Let me move my little thingy over here. So instead of sublation or obliteration of the form, F, the example F of blackness, has no result because it is impossible to divide something by 0. I have chosen infinity minus infinity or infinity divided by infinity to picture the result because it is undeterminable. It is infinity minus itself or divided by itself. It is neither life nor non-life. It is content without form, or materia prima, that which has no value because it exists as the infinity without form. Or another term for that, for those who are more invested in kind of biologies or animal science, is the plenum, or the place where all life converges in a ubiquitous sense. You know, if we think about the womb, or we think about the circumstances that surround or the periphery, or the outside of the atom. There's so many different metaphors for that space that is outside of the stringent constructions of Western man. And we can talk more about that when we get to nature. Grounding it, like taking all that higher theoretical discourse around algorithms and bringing it into a statement and an active position in art. The Kombachi River Collective Statement, which if you haven't read, I would definitely recommend, which is taking this quote that has that little cutoff for some reason. Focusing upon our own oppression is embodied in the concept of identity politics. We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression. In the case of Black women, this is a particular repugnant, dangerous, threatening, and therefore revolutionary concept, because it is obvious from looking at all the political movements that have preceded us that anyone is more worthy of liberation than ourselves. Our freedom necessitates the freedom of the world. So wanting to just situate a little deeper, like two things, the coordinates of analysis. So what is the role of artists in becoming adept with thinking about the cultural industry? And what is our role to think about how we organize our work to dream different ways that this industry operates, which is to say to have a critique of the industry and not to be a worker. Which is to be a worker that also initiates new thought and new ways of dealing with each other that are less about the individualist recognition that we face. And a lot of my work as a cultural organizer and administrator is trying to craft out spaces where those forms of working, which we can call bourgeois forms or we can call old world forms, are not necessitated as valuable. And we can talk about how more specifically too. And the second point, which I think is an interesting point as somebody who teaches in the higher ed system, is problematizing the ways that I think an objective sense, or like the most centrist sense of art pedagogy, sometimes positions identity politics as a kind of a partner ideology, one that you bring into the room by choice. Which is actually a real bastardization and a form of reductive laziness, actually, by most academicians, to think identity politics as this kind of pitting people against their subjectivities, where actually what Kombachi River Collective was saying was, when we ground our work, whatever form that is, whatever work that is, in our individual experience, we allow ourselves to show up in our more divine truth around what that might look like, a future that we live, and then allows us to work across divides, across coalitions, in a way that brings ourselves without perhaps doing the charity work of claiming that we can help someone. Because in reality, we can't help anyone. We can only help ourselves. But I would recommend that statement. It gives me a lot of energy and makes me think about collaboration in a new way, rather than just kind of an exchanging of skills. So this is a draft I'm currently working on, which the working title is called Still Life. And this image is a trefoil knot, which is a geometric equation in which all matter is interlinked. It's a bondedness that describes planetary thinking. And really quickly, it's very early drafts because of COVID. So it's an interesting time to talk about work because everything is kind of floating in prospect, and it's more practice than sharing. But this work is potentially occurring at a place called Little Island here in New York City, which was built on the West Side Highway recently, the same people who built the High Line. And it's this kind of really artificial park built in what's the kind of urban deluxe area across from the Whitney Museum. And a group of artists have been asked to kind of occupy that space and to deal with what's happened with COVID, deal with the grief of that. So I have a lot of questions about occupying that space, and part of it is thinking about this interconnection as both a place to talk about antagonisms, talk about how we have a conversation about the many people who have died. And to be very brief, there are three aspects developing. One is around this compositional body, a sub-dialuminum print cut out of a human form that's about 6 feet tall, and it's like a life-size cutout on aluminum. And I'm working with photographer Elliot Jerome Brown to deal with the archive and find a print that we will post onto that. So one act is really carrying this form, and it's a public intervention to ask audiences, help us carry this inanimate body, this byproduct of the environment, this metal body. Another form is a mixing of Haitian folkloric music with a dear collaborator, Wayne Arthur Johnson, and a dear friend, Rena Anakwe, who's a musician, and it's a freestyle. It's a cipher that happens between this Western folkloric music and these sound bath soundscapes, which she does as a witch. And the last portion is a dear collaborator, Katrina Reed, who is an interviewer interviewing the audience about what they are for, which is what they are for in the future. Okay, this second portion is thinking about nature, and feel free to cut me off at parts if need be, but I will just kind of go till the end. And this working question is a sculpture that was made between myself and S.B. Fuller. And he has a practice of producing these aquariums and asked that I choreograph something. And we were sitting with the idea of the wake and Christina Sharp's work. And so we produced this vessel, which has a vial of my blood. And over 30 days, that blood was kind of in motion and calcified. And Christina Sharp in The Wake on Blackness and Being is what I'm referencing in terms of the residence time of DNA in the ocean as it pertains to the transatlantic slave trade. Okay, I want to get to this. Let's move this out of the way. So this is, I was talking about Sylvia Wynter, and I want to talk about nature. Budur Alagra, who teaches at University of Texas, Austin, is a Black studies thinker, is actively working on Sylvia Wynter's archives. And if you don't know either of those names, I would write them down. I would recommend them. And I'm just going to give context. This is a snippet from that interview that's listed, What Will Be the Cure? In this interview, Budur is asking Sylvia Wynter, who has been a playwright, who has been a biologist, who has been a theorist, working the lineage of C.L.R. James, to talk about what she meant when she made her plays, how did she bring and bridge her creativity with her critical analysis, but also her plays and her theory ask about this thing called the third event, which is problematizing the Anthropocene. And the issue with the Anthropocene, she says, is that the Anthropocene, as created by thinkers like Donna Haraway, an ecofeminist, centers the idea that the humanity did what it did to the earth, which is indicative of this period that we find ourselves, the Anthropocene, the long-term effects of human civilization in industrial life. She's saying that narrative is incorrect because, as we can point, locations like the Caribbean are not involved in the process of extraction that we see. They have been instrumentalized by way of the incursion of the First World. So we have to think about the Anthropocene differently. We have to leverage that weight differently. We have to tell different stories, and culture's involved in that. So in response to Budur saying, your plays are sort of like a recreation of its own beginning, of a human beginning, or like staging a new drama concerning its origin. She says, yes, you've got it exactly right. And you see what happens is that what was once there must die in order for the initiation to occur and entry into the new life. It is a birth through death. And what is important are the ceremonies that occur in order for this transformation to take place. They are ceremonies structured entirely by language and art. The third event is so important because it is one that relies totally and completely on language to get us there. And in this country, we must begin to think about education as an initiation into a world full of symbols and descriptions about who we are. Thinking of it as an initiation helps us to understand the importance of introducing something else into the lives and worlds of children. Initiation also gives an understanding of the symbolic significance of education and how language and art structure the whole of our existence. We need to reinitiate ourselves, a symbolic life through death, and create ourselves anew. So I would let you go and read Black Metamorphosis. I would let you go and read the rest of this interview. That's an offshoot journal. If you want to know more, what is the third event? What was the first? What was the second? But the point is that there is a turn by enlightenment that produced the human, and we were all, as those who live in the American project, wrapped into that long-term game, which we live in now, of neoliberalism and forms of liberalisms. And what is the work of culture to try to rewrite the kinds of ways we like to, not we like to, but we are mobilized to talk about grief and violence in the same way over and over again, which is maybe the pang that people get when they say the word identity politics, that they feel like there's nothing more to say. So what is our role as artists to say something differently and to think of the archives differently to get there? And that's questions I deal with. I mean, I'm trying to deal with even more and be more intentional and think about ceremony. So our imperative is to transform culture. So a few examples of that, so it's not very abstract. June Jordan's work, Skyrise for Harlem. June Jordan was an artist and a thinker. And in this work, Skyrise for Harlem, she called upon the rendering services of Buckminster Fuller and also the kind of urban development planning knowledge he had to build out these silos that would be constructed in East Harlem as alternatives to New York Public Housing Authority, NYCHA housing, or the projects. And the goal with the rendering, as you see, is these very large and kind of cylindrical forms that made space for greenery and urban gardens and the kind of, and sunlight to come into the community, which was to say at that time, 1965, this was published in Esquire magazine, that the circumstances of the so-called ghetto or the Red Line community were both based on the fiscal realities that affected people, but also based on the kind of ecological conditions that continue to reproduce this reproductive harm. And she calls this architectural, thinking about architecture as being sensuous and eco-social and having an implied way to get us to the future we want to see. So that's planetary thinking, for an example. And that's a way of mobilizing earlier, like I said, Black and Indigenous cosmologies to think about entanglement and to think about sustainability in a real way. Real meaning real to me. Obviously, there's multiple ways to get real. The next examples are one work that I produced, and Charas, which was the art action collective based in the Lower East Side in the 70s, also worked with Buckminster Fuller, called upon the services to produce a series of geodesic domes to create a mutual aid community in the Lower East Side in the 70s. And it successfully created a series of medical clinics and food pantries and many things we have now in New York City that happen on the street, again, mutual aid services, but it built out these kind of models that were sustainable for people to be able to live. And in 2019, myself and a large group of friends produced two works called Lucifer Landing that was looking at the term Lucifer, the demonic, as it pertains to Catherine McKittrick's work, as it pertains to the ideas of the Black outdoors or Black outside, what happens in the wilderness, what happens in the natural space, what's occurred over the experience of the Great Migration. And looking at the solutionary work that has happened from Black people in America to try to solve the circumstances of that are called the Anthropocene, which includes, we rebuilt the dome that Charas was working on. We created it as a projection map surface to document a series of visits we did to plantations around America, what are now, rentable spaces for weddings. And we projected this content onto the surfaces. And in the second Lucifer Landing 2, we reproduced a kind of musical, an opera that in 5 acts went through the kind of cosmologies of the Congo, an invocation ceremony to try to think about renewal. Sylvia Winter. Okay, enough time. I'll get to the last section and then I'll shut up. Poetry. So last section is poetry. And gotta talk about Audre Lorde. So I'll just read this poetry, It's Not a Luxury, and then we only have 2 more slides and then we're done. So the quality of light by which we scrutinize our lives has direct bearing upon the product which we live and upon the changes which we hope to bring about through those lives. It is within this light that we form those ideas by which we pursue our magic and make it realized. This is poetry as illumination, for it is through poetry that we give name to those ideas which are. Until the poem, nameless and formless, about to be birthed, but already felt, the distillation of experience from which true poetry springs birds' thought, as dream birds' concept, as feeling birds' idea, as knowledge birds precedes understanding. When we view living in the European mode only as a problem to be solved, we then rely solely upon our ideas to make us free. For these were what the white fathers told us were precious. But as we become more in touch with our own ancient Black non-European view of living as a situation to be experienced and interacted with, we learn more and more to cherish our feelings and to respect those hidden sources of power from where true knowledge and therefore lasting action comes. And I think there's a lot that could be said there. And I think, if Audre Lorde was still alive, she would even probably problematize what European meant and the white fathers. But to get to 2 points in my work that I'm working with right now, I'm thinking a lot about the necessity for art when you're not deemed essential, and also the necessity for poetry when so much desires for us to have very concretized responses that also deflect from the kind of ways that might reperform ableism, not permit really radical transformative futures for accessibility and ways of dealing, and ways that people will need space if we want to construct a future where we do not have prisons. And so syncretic religions of the Caribbean are something that's operating for me. I'm thinking about this in relationship to voodoo and Santeria, and how these practices, while spiritual practices, so they are already calling upon us to believe in more than our own individual experience, to call upon entities, loa, spirits, are also encoded within them. They have choreographies of the Maroon communities. They have choreographies of the descent across the transatlantic. They have within them these deep narratives and teleological histories about how to organize our relationship to ecology and family and finances, which is a very anarchic, and I'm trying to incorporate more anarchism into the way that I speak about Blackness. It's a Black anarchic document that is also poetic because it calls upon a beyond. And I'm trying to organize how that sphere both grounds me in my day-to-day in a time where I'm in quarantine, but also comes into my practice. And then ceremony as a verb is very interesting to me, which I picked up from Alexis Pauline Gumbs, certainly, who's kind of local to your area a lot of the time. She's in Durham, but she comes around, I know, and works a lot with Jennifer Harge in Detroit. But ceremony as a verb, through Aria Dean's writing, makes me think about how when we produce ceremony, we slow down the consumption rate, which we can say about many things, but certainly about Black consumption. Especially to be a Black artist working in the industry of culture, you have to become very attuned to who is your community, and also how are you going to deal with deceleration, because the speed of culture consumes, like the grammars of the American project Black Flesh. So the last things I will say in these 8 minutes. Alexis Pauline Gumbs. So this is just a section from Dub. And if you haven't read this, I would recommend it. But thinking about how I'm calling ceremony is certainly from her, and what she does with all of the people that she names and how she makes sure to name. So taking a subsection of her day-to-day writings for ceremony, we would like it if you wrote us poems. We would like it if you wrote us long life sentences. We would like it if you broke sentences and gave us more than you or we were told could be contained. We would like it if you remained. We would like it if you showed up every day. We would like it if you drank water. We would love it if you would turn off your phone. We would sincerely appreciate it if you stopped pretending to be alone, which, is just essential. So 2 questions maybe I will ask you all on the studio visits for those that I have that time with. And if you would like to get in touch with me and we don't have studio visits, you can feel free to contact me through the chat or connect either through Luke or Rebecca with my contact information, and I'd be happy to be in communication. What are the essential needs you require to do your creative work every day, which comes out of a dear friend, Ron Reagan, who's been working in philanthropy for a lot of years and created a podcast in which he's trying to ask us that question so we can divest from systems that don't work for us, for instance, like grant models or foundations, which I have been the privilege to be a recipient of, but I do think we need to think very deeply about what we reinforce when we reinforce the kinds of bourgeois and petty bourgeois narratives of these residencies and structures that perhaps might not serve our greater goal to the ways that we want to communicate to our audiences or communicate our imagination, or in time. And maybe they do, but what ways do they serve you? It's not all or nothing. The second one is, what kind of creative ecology and institutional relationship do you desire? And I've been doing some work this previous year with an institution called Performance Space New York, primarily working with them to rewrite their mission statement and their strategic goal for 3 to 5 years, which is a very different kind of work to be an administrator and see how the organization operates. And I would ask that question of each of you as you finish your degree. What do you want out of this kind of creative ecology, wherever you land geographically? I'm going to read this to finish because we have enough time. And this is a writing that I did recently for a magazine called Earwave, which is a sonic music magazine that a friend of mine, Jules Jabron, who's a sculptor, asked me to write. And this is looking at catastrophe and looking at the work of Kamau Brathwaite and trying to write it all down. And the triplet is written as 911. So resonance beyond any singular catastrophe, a hymn. The catastrophe is not an event, but an arc. Poetry steps in as anatomy containing the fibers of warlike memory casted by fire, through word from ear to page to non-human testimony earthbound. To bear witness is not enough. The murderous deconstruct, change everything, your word, your love language, your economics of inhabitation. No ceremony, a swing step, a yanvalu, an awakening takes over, come child. Rename emergency, call upon righteous divinity for safety here. No state shall survive. No one will reside singular at the end of the world as we know it. Caution, knowing otherwise excretes alarm of a local timbre of a peopled wail. Onto the ears of the wardens triggered from your scent alone rootkits. Sonic color lines dispose of voice and gesture to the spirit realm. Carceral mortality, Babaluye syncretizes a minuet stepped, bass drone portals secrete liquid afterbirth fed to the beyond in honor of shared existences. Grace notes mimic the hark of birds. We set Lang Lang on the doorstep of this new earth, bathing Yemaya and sent at sundown. The earthquake trembles through us, an exhale of relief. Let me move this to the side. We set Lang Lang bathing. Nambala exchanges center stage, fortifying our paths ahead, a serpentine undulation. From crown to anal opening, we speak a cipher the state fears. Erotic resonances that cause sublimation upon ourselves, remembering subterranean temporality, 7-figured proprioceptors, feeling out our travel as cadre cantata soars. To decipher obstructions to come, what is the journey? Singularity obfuscates ancestry inherited from unnamed rebels, whistleblowers, inceptors, fugitives, mambos. Make is plural, we make. We for each other are bounded unequivocally. Break pentameter, break from the expressive logics of desirability and herd secular pastimes called value that flood our pores when we are inside of each other. Choreographies of marinage shape our mouths and brows positionally, shoulders flying. Wrist unshackled and Ebo evoking an unconsented possession teaches we are soil. Residence time instructs our gesture are not dances but alchemy, spilling out of geometric forms and confines to memorization. Post-nationalist technologies and praxis are learned through loss. You are the only material, calling upon one another for opening to that their urgent world if you decide, if you decide, if you decide. Decide, decide. Okay, 2 minutes. final points, I think this is like, feels a bit like comical, but it's actually very true. Black feminist studies is crucial. If you got anything, I hope you got that. Black feminist studies is crucial. It will save your life, and it does. The second one is culture is an urgent vehicle for futurist possibility. And I'm really thinking about that as someone who's teaching inside of an institution where I also am interfacing with students studying art. And I think a lot about what will be the world that they will be presented as they leave from their degree programs, and what will be their role. And what do we need? What do we need for those of us who are professional artists working in the field? We need people who are ready to make space and to push up against the kinds of narratives that have been given. Recommendations, I think what I did was just try to create a constellation and not over prepare like a way that I think I am. I'm just vamping, but with a clear intention about what are the principles and the people that show up, and maybe mapping that out for yourself from time to time will give you grounding. Fourth, returning to the question, to name the conditions to which your work would be ideally imagined, produced, shared, and with who? And I think that's a hard question. It's on my dry erase board. I still have to answer it, but I think it's very essential, especially because the industry itself and the kinds of funding that exist are rapidly always going to be shifting. And we recognize our position inside of the greater scheme of the American world when our industry pauses. And what does that mean for how you will build your work? And I said it already, but do not settle for the narrative that you've been given. Okay, so let me stop sharing. 7 o'clock on the dot. And that's it for me. I'm going to be quiet. I'm done. I appreciated your time. Thank you for being so attentive and listening. It'd be great to have done this in person. And that's all I have. If you want to be in touch or leave any questions, please do. I think we might have to move onward, but Luke, you'll let us know.
I think so. We usually keep a little bit of time at the end of the lecture for some questions. So I think if you're open to answering some, great. We'll keep some open for some questions, which is sort of up to folks here if they want to unmute and say them or put them in the chat. Up to you.
Either is fine. I would love to hear voices personally, but there's no pressure.
Hi, I have a question. This is Peppa. I'm sorry my camera's off. I'm in an Uber. But I thank you so much for your talk. I have so much to think about, and really yeah, thank you so much. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about your process. You're like seems like you're working on a few things right now, and you spoke on collaboration a little bit. But I just feel like you're bringing in so many kind of different ways of working, and I'm wondering, like, in your process, like, how are those things flourishing, and is there a kind of one thing's coming first, or excuse me, yeah, if you could talk on that, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Peppa. I'm very appreciative always of the person calling from the Uber or the Lyft, so it's very good. And I mean that. So answering your question, I think right now that looks differently, but right now during this period, I'm trying to commit to, and not saying that that's something you should do, an every morning, which I feel privileged to put my phone on Do Not Disturb, stay until 12 o'clock, I'm not able to be contacted, and kind of leave time for what needs to be said. Which for me right now is looking like beginning with writing and kind of doing the work of spilling out everything that's occurred the night before or has been on my mind. And that could move into drafting something. And some of these drafted works that you saw that I'm working towards have been good because I've been grounding into, okay, so I'm trying to deal with a screen. What are the things that I know about working with the body as a primary form and a primary force that I want to feel sensuous or I appreciate about being mediatized through a screen, you know? So sound is very, I don't know if that came through, but sound is very profound for me. I trained as a musician, and like trying to sculpt out the way that I cannot be in contact with you physically, but there is a sense of kind of resonance that affects you, that moves you, that is intoxicating and also perhaps dissonant. Those things are playing out with me in just like listening, drafting out the composition, sitting with people over Zoom and showing them and getting that kind of trial and error. I also, just on like a more informal tip, I do kind of like a Sunday reading group series with a group of friends that I really like. And we do kind of like a sharing of work, sharing of process, sharing of ideas, which has built out a place to feel like I'm still in critique and like with my people doing what I do with them. And I would recommend that.
Beautiful, thank you.
I had a question around kind of going off of Peppa's question about your process in your work. How does it have a relationship to, and how do you think about like the internet and online connectivity, since we've been all online and trying to connect these days, and how do you think that affects you? But also, how do you think about your work being represented on the internet? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. I'm normally really difficult as an artist when it comes to like getting my materials to put them on the internet. As you might see with my photo that I offered you all, I don't really use like headshots, and I have a kind of revulsion to that kind of representation. It's kind of like, it's probably like an old world-ism, but I feel like I want to do my best to center the work, and I want to do my best to decenter myself. And to get to like the root of what you're asking, my engagement with the internet is I have a website. I have a website in which I take in and I look at Adrian Piper's work. When I think about this, I want to have an archive that I have built out, that I feel like I'm building out with others, both in terms of the syntax, the semantics, the language, the way that images are represented, the way that videos are able to be accessed. And I want to name that space. And it took a while to get there, to even feel like the website was a place I desired. It was certainly by force, by way of applying for things for many years, that needed to be a thing. And it's actually become a place where I feel like I can do the best version of archiving of my work, certainly better than institutions can. And then in terms of like ways that press operates, which I feel like is the other part of your question, I have particularly tried to work with people that I already am in deep dialogue and rooted inside of a political analysis if they're writing about my work or trying to deal with some form of packaging and translation, whether that's a review or a preemptive review. And for the film, for instance, a dear friend of mine who's actually staying with me right now, Joss Sayer, who's an environmental psychologist, who's an advisor to Ruth Wilson Gilmore, is writing the kind of text for the film that you're seeing, The Smallest Unit Is Each Other. And, you know, I've found through practice that for me, I'm not effective in terms of using things like social media, and nor do I have investments in kind of the ways that those algorithms do not serve my work as work that's trying to reduce the ease and the thirst trap, because the thirst trap is built on the plight of so many of us. So, you know, I'm dealing with that tension, and I hold space for everyone in my generation dealing with that tension, because I know it's not easy. So, yeah.
Question about the way that you structured your lecture was more like a lecture of of ideas, and you talk a lot about your work in terms of body. So I was curious if this lecture would be different than prior lectures before you were dealing with it. Like if you had come in person, you mentioned you would like to be here in person. How would it be different, or would it be different? Is this kind of a strategy for decentering the self, or is it yeah, just could you speak to that of your reasons for creating a lot of reading and kind of clips of text versus something that maybe is in performative style? And you talked about it is performance, but I'm curious about it.
Thank you. Yeah, certainly. I think there is definitely a difference in comparison to being in person. That is about, I think if we were in person, we would have all gotten up at some point and did something that involved moving this information through the room. And I do typically like to do that. I think for this time, I recognize since we've gone into quarantine here in New York, that grounding into what is the body of work that I've been doing, which I would wonder about each of you. What is the body of work that you've been busy with making, and what are its principles? And not trying to look for answers around that, but trying to ask really interesting questions about how to stay inspired, which there was quite a long period of a lull, I feel like, for many of the people that I was talking to, that they couldn't imagine or do anything. And I feel like for now, I'm getting more conversations with people who are starting to feel the feeling of creative spirit and feeling of place and purpose. And so grounding ceremony, which is the last thing that I said, has organized my lecture today, naming the kinds of authors who've inspired the kind of course and the kind of ways that I'm looking towards course correction in terms of my practice and moving forward, both in my artistic work, but also in the kind of engagements I do outside of that too, as a cultural organizer. And I don't know if that would be distinctly different, but I imagine that if we would have done it in person or prior to the pandemic, that there would have potentially been more space overall for us to move and to take breaks and to drink water and to talk in different ways about it, which being in person for me really enchants. Yeah.
Can you talk more about how body and sensuality relates to your urge to decenter yourself? Because I feel like sensuality has so much to do with self. So I'm interested in how those two things relate for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's partially my question about personally spirituality. I think when I look at people that I've really admired who have been artists, they've had a very committed and devoted spiritual practice, and that work permits them to be both a vessel and also in relationship to a much bigger work than themselves. Because there's a really important contradiction. I'm trying to decenter myself, but I still have to be present here today to talk to you. So, I'm not, there's another version of fugitive refusal, which I just don't say yes to anything, and I commit to another form of practice. But in terms of a spiritual channel, thinking about people like Milford Graves, and the work that Milford Graves did came so deeply out of his desire to understand how he could bring the cosmologies of spirituality and enlightenment that are coming through the work he was doing into his body in a kind of choreographic practice, into his sound as an improvisational practice. So it goes a little back to Peppa's question. My creative process desires for improvisation as a vehicle for survival. So I get in conversation a lot like this with friends, and we talk and we talk and we talk and we talk. And what surmises is something that feels very intentionally from, honestly, and this sounds very cliche, but does come from a quite deep guttural place that says, this is something that needs to be ventured. And I feel like you all can talk about that too, in terms of your work. What made you do that? And that kind of moment of inflection has been many things. It has been about being at the right time, but has more importantly become over time about grounding inside of a spiritual presence, grounding inside of a kind of being with spirit, being with ghost, and honing that space, like honoring that space, and knowing that space in terms of sensuality and embodiment, when you work choreographically, for those who work that way, there's a language about working on the somatic level, which is the soma. So you're working not just kind of the subjective form, but you're working the flesh and the tissue and the bone, and you're shifting its state. And there's a lot of really wonderful Feldenkrais is one practice that thinks about this. Body Brain Fringe Cohen's mind-body work, it thinks about this. You know, I mentioned Voodoo, I mentioned Santeria, I mentioned Catherine Dunham technique. There are all these different practices that try to mobilize your cellular level to transition. It's called a state change. Possession is one of those things. So when I try to talk about choreography, I talk about it as a kind of portal or a vehicle. I don't think about it as kind of, in a modern dance sense, people moving, people memorizing movement. There's no memorization ever. I don't think so, maybe a long time ago. But there's primarily kind of drivers, scores, initiations, circumstances that happen in front of an audience. And what happens, what you might see is a shift in the environment over time. And that awakening tries to synthesize all of this deep research into an event and deal with it as poetry. Everything's not going to get known, but something's going to happen. And that experience is going to reverberate and resonate in its individual ways for each of us. And that feels similar to perhaps a spiritual convening. Yeah.
Hi. I was wondering if you could talk more about like collaboration in your work and maybe how it's changed now being in this time versus like being more like in an environment, like especially with like viewer participation or collaboration, how that like, has it shifted? Has it, yeah, anyway.
I would say that it actually has gotten better because I don't know about you all, but I think also generally like friendships have gotten better because there's a kind of like, for me, accountability systems are like such a popular language conversation now, like the love language nowadays is accountability. So everyone's kind of like thinking about it and it's on the tip of our tongues. And the hardest part about creative collaboration is that there, at least in my processes, it seems like most of the time, there's quite a lot of leaning in, and that work is, it's messy. It's really messy in the way that it's anarchic, in that it brings a lot of each of us into the room. And we can organize power, and we can talk about democratic forms of decision making, and we can strategize ahead of time how we're going to deal with compensation and changing labor that's going to happen. But there's still things that get brought up when a group of people try to produce something from our collective imaginations and worldings into the world and then give it out. And that process has always traditionally brought in a really important gap, which is like the kinds of ways that we slow down to have really important dialogues around like, well, something happened yesterday in our brief encounters that we really need to get back to. And there's always these moments of harm. And Mariam Kaba talks about the fact that you get two people in the room, harm's going to happen. It has nothing to do with, you know, this person is a traditional, like, you know, this person is a traditional harm doer because of blah, 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 per se subjective. People will harm each other. And collaboration, if anything, the faith in doing collaboration is that you recognize that it is difficult work. Yeah. So now we do a lot of Zoom conversations and we do funny, like kinds of like mock-ups of things, and we give each other a lot of space. And prior to this moment, I think that there was a severity that we put on ourselves as collaborators and on each other to show up in ways, even though we thought we were doing otherwise. You know, I would say I feel very gifted to come from a kind of queer cosmology of people who are doing really interesting work around mental health, doing really interesting work around prison abolition historically. So I think we're probably working on it a lot more than some other people are even working on it, but we still fuck up. And so I think we're getting a bit better, all of us from all our vantage points, in naming when you feel harm and when it's harm versus conflict, which has made our collaborations over Zoom, you know, more fun. Like they're just really more fun too, which has been desirable. And also more brave. But we're not making anything that's going to be public. And that's also it too. So removing that kind of, removing that end date does something too, which is maybe a quest to say, who are you always talking to, and what ways are you talking to them, as if you were always going to be showing something? You know, what are you building in each conversation that feels very real and materialized in that moment without having an end date? So, yeah.
I'm still trying to formulate this question in my head, so I'm sorry if it doesn't make any sense. You were talking about how when you gather or just kind of talk with a group of people and you reach this sort of like sacred moment where like things start to arise and you get inspiration. Um, I'm wondering, is that something you can experience alone? And I'm also wondering if that is the same feeling a performer gets when performing. Like, does there need to be dialogue, or is it just the presence of being with people?
That's great. That's a really lovely question. I'll go backwards in answering it. I think that being being in performance for me, because I performed in a lot of different contexts as a performer, like in a traditional sense, like someone is director and I've been hired to learn things. And then I've been in contexts where we're all kind of building this out, and it's like it's a clown piece. Like we all have it, something we're bringing out of the car. I've had multiple variations where power has been shared. And I think that what I've experienced when there is a moment of kind of like, I think about like Josephine Baker, like this moment where like the situation of the stage and performing is like this overwhelm that like really inspires. That is distinctly different for me from the need to say something through my practice. Those are two very different things. You know, and when it comes to wanting to expose and meaning like exposition, like work through, like, you know, it's really tiresome work to like also produce, you know, and it's also tiresome work to dream and to make. And when you do that work, for me, it feels, to go back to Studio Apartment, it feels like uncovering. It feels like really a process of exhuming bones. It feels like a process of trying to come into a deeper degree of intimacy, both with the engagements of me and the people I'm working with in the ways that we are dealt with in the world and that we deal with each other. And then the audience is a part of that too. So the sacred moment is, we bring these complications, we bring this situation, this circumstance, like the sculpture that was at PS1, which was this projection surface map. And the way that an audience interfaced with this surface mapped geodesic dome model inside of this vast dome in itself. And there was compost on the ground and a kind of scent of compost taking over from days of sitting in there in this enclosure. And one audience member was allowed at a time to go into this space. They were allowed to be there as long as they would like. And the process of one audience member going in there is both a quest for them to have a moment, maybe not to have what you're mentioning in terms of this like kind of ecstatic experience, but to have a moment to sit with the complications that come up when you start making something. The complications in that instance being materiality, sustainability, the circumstances of Black life as they pertain to the end of the world, premature death. And being there with no one else mediating how they respond, with no one else watching them if they say, fuck this, or I'm crying, or I'm into this, or I'm not, and like having amount of time that they need to process that. And that feels like a sacred moment, because it also, while it does something interesting conceptually, it also demands that the person not be given cues, which I feel like is something I've been trying to make space for with people in choreography out of a Black tradition. Choreography so much of the time is kind of pigeonholed inside of these veneers of entertainment and virtuosity. And actually, you know, just the will to be embodied is such a risk. So, you know, like saying, there is no front, there is no stage, there's a circumstance, you're in here, you have to decide your engagements with this. And it's not a gallery, it's not, there's no security around, your container is yours. And also this material you have no relationship to until you arrive inside of it. The circumstance of the unknown, to go back to Sylvia Wynter, calls upon us to think otherwise. So that feels sacred. And that feels like the feeling personally I feel when, and it's not one conversation, it's a series of being together and sitting alone. So answering your question, sometimes it is alone, throwing things on this dry erase board, that something happens, not as an ecstatic moment, but something happens that says that there is a missing link inside of this communication. I can't say that that crosses over for other people, because my endeavor is to work through Black feminist studies to understand a kind of archival knowledge as it pertains to Black work, to revolution, to anarchy, and to a spirit that will undo the kind of harm that exists in this world. That's a very specific work. I don't make work for intrigue or innovation. I make work from a rooted ideology to undo and to do what brings me joy, which is to do things that typically don't happen alone. You know, I don't make things alone. And that's a political thing too.
Thank you.
I'm thinking maybe time for one more or so.
I have an unformed question since no one's asking. Utopia, you know, Buckminster Fuller, Utopia, you're talking about these sort of principles and ideologies. What is your relationship to utopia? You know, like, do you feel like you're interested in that? Is that something you definitely are not? I mean, you're in a process right now, so it doesn't really necessarily have to be about a end goal of utopia. I just was curious of like what your relationship to that was.
Yeah, that's came up in a conversation recently, actually, so it's kind of fresh, because a friend of mine who was an artist, we were all on a call, and someone said from an institution, well, we're going to have to do what we did in terms of this press release because we have to get money. You know, we still have to get money. And someone responded on the call, we have to be idealists, like we have to do something else. We have to do something else. And it was in regard to this kind of press release that was very redundant and using a lot of language that was untrue, things that actually produced a lot of harm, like racial equity statements that were not true, land acknowledgement statements that were really false with no strategic plan. And so we were pushing back against this institution, and the institution is actually quite like proximate. We know each other enough to for them to be honest and say, well, we're trying to increase our budget. You know, culture has been gutted in this city. And, you know, it was in that moment where traditionally, I think a conversation would have been, we get it, you know, or maybe, you know, well, let's try to make some reform with the language. And actually we were able collectively to, like, I feel like the vibration was risen to a level to say, actually, no, maybe utopia isn't tomorrow, but if we do not hold tight to the line of what that is, we will be taken for anything. We will say yes to things that we do not agree with. And it is those small cuts that actually produce a big wound and a callousing to being able to really name the kind of future you want to see. So I'm trying, and I really respect this question, like when I look at Buckminster Fuller's work, which I first found primarily through Buckminster Fuller, highly interested, wanted to build these things and understand him. And it was through studying him that I found all these racialized dimensions around the work that were not being considered, which were, you know, how did this housing not just interface with the third world as developing, but the first world as a developing space, right? Which is, you know, the greater question of why NGOs should no longer exist, which there's a theorist named Olivia Rutazibwa who thinks about this, and she works in global development studies, a Black scholar. But, you know, when we root ourselves in our place, we recognize that there's quite a lot of work to do. And if we do not have a really clear idea about our engagement with futurity and, you know, a radical, bold visioning, then we will be taken for anything. So utopia is like really hard because I don't know what the contours and shape of it like. What is that, you know, and what will erotic feel like there, and what will family mean there, and how will we deal with the finite resources of our time in the earth? But I do think that as artists, we have a huge privilege to be able to enchant the possibility of otherwise. And that is like a luxury. And we are part of a history of people you know, who have been murdered for that, who have been sacrificed for that, you know, who have been taken to task for trying to produce those systems. And that still happens today. So, you know, I think about my friends who are artists in Cuba who are revolting right now against the parliament for censorship. And so you know, it's like, and you have to do a kind of location about what is not right for you, and then look out again using Kombachi River collective statements to see what is not right for all of us, and get in right relationship with people who challenge you. And then you recognize that utopia is not a vision, it's a day-to-day practice. Like, it's a day-to-day work to talk across your differences, to figure out how to get in alignment with the production that actually meets the desires that you see the world being and growing towards. And, you know, and that makes the work of Buckminster Fuller a little obsolete, but the intentions, they are very grounded. You know, you can build the thing, you can build it, you know, and that's a process. So yeah.
It's a beautiful way to end your lecture in terms of, yeah, it's great. Thank you.
Thank you for all your questions. It was such a pleasure. Really appreciate it.
So thank you so much, Jonathan. You're set up with Luke in terms of studio visits, then, I understand? Yeah, just to stay up a little longer. Okay, thank you. Really, really appreciate your time.
Thank